What's the most unsettling sound you can hear when you're home alone? It's not the floorboards creaking. It's not a branch tapping against the window. It's the sound of your own name, spoken in a whisper, when no one else is supposed to be there. It's a sound that breaks the rules of reality, a violation of your solitude. Today, we're exploring 5 true, chilling stories from people who heard that impossible sound and whose lives were forever changed by it. But before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Whispered Fear and ring that bell so you never miss a whisper.
Don't go up there.
Our first story comes from Sarah, a 22-year-old graduate student in architectural history who desperately needed a letter of recommendation. The letter was to be from her most intimidating professor, Dr. Alistair Albright, a man known for his academic brilliance and an equally brilliant cold detachment from his students. When Albright, in a rare moment of approachability, offered her a house-sitting job over a long winter break, she saw it as the perfect, if unnerving, opportunity. The pay was generous, and the quiet, he assured her, would be perfect for working on her thesis. The house, however, was a character in itself. A massive 3-story Victorian set back from a quiet road on the edge of town. It loomed over the neighboring properties like a forgotten monument from a darker time. Its gables were sharp, its windows like vacant eyes. A wrought iron fence, rusted in places, enclosed a garden long surrendered to weeds and thorns. Professor Albright's final instructions were delivered on the heavy oak front step, his breath pluming in the frigid air. His tone was clipped, precise, and left no room for questions. The cat's name is Marcus. He is to be fed twice a day. The plants in the conservatory require water every other day. And one more thing, Miss Jennings, he said, his gaze hardening slightly. The attic is off limits. It is structurally unsound and contains delicate family heirlooms. For your own safety, and for my privacy, you are forbidden from going up there. Any violation of this rule will be a violation of our agreement. He didn't need to elaborate. Sarah understood perfectly. Her much-needed recommendation letter hung in the balance. She watched him drive away, then turned to face the house. The door at the top of the second-floor landing, the one leading to the attic, was sealed with a heavy, ornate bolt. It looked less like a lock and more like a piece of medieval hardware, a declaration that whatever was behind that door was meant to stay there. The first night was a study in silence, an oppressive, heavy quiet that seemed to absorb all sound. Sarah moved through the cavernous rooms, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The house was a museum of a life she couldn't comprehend. Heavy, velvet curtains, dark wood furniture, and oil portraits lining the hallways whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every move. She felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a place that was merely tolerating her presence. She went to bed feeling foolish for her unease, bundling under the covers in the guest room and telling herself it was just an old house. The second night, the house began to breathe. As she sat in the grand, silent living room, trying to read, she heard it. A faint, distant sound from upstairs. It was the soft, rolling sound of a single marble, skittering across a wooden floor before stopping abruptly. She froze, straining to hear more. Nothing, just the groan of the house settling, the wood contracting in the winter cold. She took a deep breath, her heart a little too fast, and dismissed it. Later, as she was drifting off to sleep, another sound came. It was so faint, so delicate, she almost missed it. A sound like dry leaves being brushed against a microphone. A whisper. It was formless, a sibilant hiss that coiled at the edge of her hearing. S-sa-ra. She sat bolt upright in bed, fully awake, her heart hammering against her ribs. The room was cold, the silence absolute. It had to be the wind. It had to be the old radiator system. She spent the rest of the night with the lamp on, sleep thoroughly banished. The next day, she tried to immerse herself in her work, to fill the house with the sound of her typing, to reclaim the space with logic and reason. But the feeling of being watched was relentless. She felt it most strongly on the second-floor landing, near the attic door. A palpable cold seemed to radiate from it. That evening, Determined to prove it was all in her head, she made a cup of tea and forced herself to sit in the armchair at the end of the hall, directly facing the attic door. For an hour, there was nothing. Then it came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was a voice, a dry and papery whisper coming directly from the other side of the door. Sarah. It was clear, deliberate. It wasn't the wind. She didn't move, didn't breathe. She just sat there, frozen, as the single word hung in the air before being swallowed again by the silence. She abandoned her tea and retreated to her room, barricading the door with a chair. A gesture she knew was useless, but it made her feel marginally better. She sent a text to her best friend Kayla. "This house is officially creeping me out." The reply came a minute later. "LOL, don't watch any horror movies. Just think about that recommendation letter." The response, meant to be comforting, only made Sarah feel more alone, more isolated in her growing fear. She knew she should have left then. Every rational part of her mind screamed at her to pack her bags, leave the key, and forget the professor and his letter. But curiosity, or perhaps something more profound, some feeling of being tethered to the house's sorrow, kept her there. To distract herself the next day, she explored the professor's vast library. The room smelled of leather and old paper. Tucked away on a high, dusty shelf, she found a heavy, leather-bound photo album. The cover was blank. She took it down, her fingers leaving trails in the dust, and sat on the floor to open it. What she saw inside would change the nature of the whisper from a simple haunting to a terrifying puzzle. The photos were old, sepia-toned, and chronicled the Albright family. There was the professor, younger, thinner, but with the same cold eyes. There was his wife, a woman with a perpetually worried expression, who seemed to shrink in every photo she appeared in. And then there was their daughter, a small, pale girl with large, sad eyes, who never once smiled in any of the pictures. Sarah flipped through the pages, a growing sense of melancholy washing over her. On the back of a photo of the little girl, standing alone in the overgrown garden, a spidery script read, "Sarah, age 7. Sarah's blood ran cold." The whisper wasn't just a random sound. It was personal, but she couldn't yet comprehend how deeply personal it truly was. Was it calling to her? Or was it the echo of the other Sarah, the sad-eyed girl from the photographs? That final night, the house was colder than ever. A winter storm had moved in, and the wind howled outside, rattling the old window frames. Sarah was huddled in bed, unable to sleep, when the whisper returned. It wasn't just a name this time. It was a desperate, childlike plea, clear as day, coming from the attic door. "Sarah, he's coming home soon. Please, you have to help me." The voice was filled with such genuine terror that it broke through Sarah's own fear. This wasn't a malicious spirit. This was something frightened, something trapped. She thought of the little girl in the photos. She had to know. She had to break the rule. Grabbing a flashlight, she left her room and ascended the stairs. The air on the landing was freezing. She stood before the attic door, her breath a cloud in the flashlight's beam, and reached for the antique bolt. It was cold and stiff. She pulled with all her might, her muscles straining. The metal groaned in protest. She pulled again and again, gritting her teeth, until finally, with a deafening thunk that echoed through the silent house, the bolt slid free. Her heart pounding, she pushed the door inward. It didn't open to a dusty attic filled with boxes and forgotten furniture. It opened to a child's bedroom. The room was a time capsule of sorrow, perfectly preserved but coated in a thick, uniform layer of gray dust that covered everything like a funeral shroud. A small bed with a faded quilt, a wooden rocking horse with one eye missing, a dollhouse with its tiny furniture askew. The air was stale, suffocating, a testament to decades of stillness. In the far corner, on a small wooden chair, sat an old reel-to-reel tape recorder. She walked toward it, her footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. Her hand trembling, she reached out and pressed the play button. A soft hiss filled the room, the sound of old tape. Then a child's voice, small and frightened, began to speak. "My name is Sarah. Daddy locked me in again. He says I have to be quiet." He doesn't like noise. The voice paused, followed by a shaky breath. There's someone new downstairs. I heard him talking to her. Her name is Sarah, too. I have to warn her. He's coming home. Then another voice cut in. This one from the background of the tape. A deeper, gravelly voice she recognized instantly. It was Dr. Albright's. You will stay here, Sarah. You will learn to be silent. The tape ended, the hiss returning. Sarah stumbled back, the flashlight dropping from her hand and rolling across the floor. The whisper wasn't a ghost. It was a recording, a tormented echo from a past she couldn't imagine, an eternal warning. At that exact moment, she heard it. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside, the sound of a car door shutting, and then the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock of the front door downstairs. Professor Albright was home early. Panic seized her. She scrambled for the attic door, her mind screaming. She had to close it, lock it, pretend she'd never been there. She grabbed the heavy door and pulled it shut, fumbling in the dark for the bolt. She tried to slide it back into place, but the old rusted metal wouldn't budge. It was stuck. It wouldn't lock from the inside. She heard his heavy, deliberate footsteps on the stairs. First floor, now the second. He was walking down the hall. She backed away from the door into the dusty darkness of the child's room and squeezed herself into an old, musty wardrobe, pulling the door shut until only a thin crack remained. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the attic door. The door creaked open. A large silhouette filled the doorway, blocking the dim light from the hallway. He stood there for a long moment, surveying the room. He didn't seem surprised that the door was open. He seemed to have been expecting it. He slowly turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing directly on the wardrobe where she was hiding. Through the crack, she saw his face break into a slow, thin, horrifying smile. He whispered, his voice no longer a recorded echo, but live, resonant, and terribly close. I knew you'd be curious, Sarah. Now, you can learn the lesson of silence, just like the others.
I can hear you.
Our next story comes from a man named Mark, a 28-year-old graphic designer who believed that logic and modern design could solve any problem. He had just moved into the Apex Lofts, a brand new, minimalist apartment building downtown. It was his sanctuary: polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a state-of-the-art sealed HVAC system that the building manager proudly described as whisper quiet. For Mark, who craved order and silence after years in a noisy old walk-up, it was perfect. The silence was the entire point. For the first week, it was exactly that. Pure, uninterrupted quiet. He felt in control, at peace, but in a building made of concrete and glass, some old fears find new ways to travel. It began subtly. Whenever the building's highly efficient heating system would kick on, a faint metallic hiss would emanate from the vents. It was a clean, mechanical sound, but there was a strange undertone to it, a resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate at the edge of his hearing. He dismissed it. New buildings make new noises. It was logical. A few nights later, the hiss seemed to gain a pattern. It wasn't just the uniform sound of air moving through metal. There were fluctuations, dips, and rises that sounded almost organic. As he lay in bed, he found himself listening to it, trying to map its rhythm. It sounded like a sibilant whisper, distorted and buried deep within the hum. He told himself it was stress, the pressure of a new project at work. His mind was just looking for patterns where there were none. Then came the night that shattered his logic. He was working late, the only light in the apartment coming from the glow of his monitor. The HVAC system hummed its usual tune. He was so focused on his work that he almost didn't register it at first. But then it came, cutting through the mechanical drone with impossible clarity. It was his name, Mark. It was long, drawn out, and seemed to come from every vent in the apartment at once. The one in the living room, the one in the bedroom, the one in the hall. It was a chorus of one, a dry and ancient sound that had no place in the sterile modern machinery of the building. He shot up from his chair, his heart instantly seizing. The apartment was dead silent again, save for the gentle hum of the heater. He stood there, motionless, for nearly 10 minutes, straining to hear it again. It didn't come. The next day, he called maintenance. An older, grizzled man named Stan arrived, his tool belt clinking with a weary authority. Mark explained the situation, feeling ridiculous as the words left his mouth. "I'm hearing a voice from the vents." Stan gave him a look that was half pity, half annoyance. "Son, I've been doing this for 30 years. Let me show you something." He unrolled a set of building blueprints on the kitchen counter. "See this?" he said, tapping a diagram of Mark's unit. "This is a closed-loop system. Each unit is sealed. The air that circulates in your apartment only circulates in your apartment. It's not connected to your neighbors, not connected to the hallway. It's impossible for a voice to travel through these vents from another unit." He checked the system, found nothing wrong, and left with a shrug. "It's just the building settling, kid. They all make noise." Stan's logical explanation should have been a comfort. Instead, it was terrifying. If the sound wasn't coming from another apartment, then where was it coming from? His rational mind, now at war with his senses, Mark became obsessed. He bought a high-fidelity audio recorder and placed it directly in front of the main vent. He let it run for hours. Playing it back, all he could hear was the same mechanical hum and white noise. But Mark was a designer. He knew his way around software. He imported the audio into an editing program, applying noise cancellation filters and isolating specific frequencies. And there it was, a faint, distorted waveform hidden beneath the noise. It looked like human speech, but it was too corrupted to be intelligible. It was proof, but proof of what? He didn't know. What's the creepiest, most unexplainable sound you've ever heard in your own home? Let me know in the comments below. For Mark, the mystery of the sound was just the beginning of his nightmare. The whispers became a nightly occurrence. They grew bolder. "Mark, find me." One night. "It's so cold in here." Another. He stopped sleeping. He left the HVAC system off, choosing to freeze in the winter air rather than listen to the voice. His work suffered. His friends told him. He looked haggard, paranoid. He tried to explain, but how do you tell someone your apartment is whispering to you? His isolation fueled his obsession. He began researching the history of the land the building was on. It had been an empty lot for decades, but before that, in the mid-20th century, a government building had stood there. A nondescript office block demolished in the 80s. Records were sparse, but he found a single archived newspaper article from 1968 mentioning an unfortunate incident at the building involving a federal employee. The details were classified. After 2 weeks of this torment, sleep-deprived and on the verge of a breakdown, Mark knew he had to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't live like this anymore. One Saturday night, armed with a screwdriver and a flashlight, he approached the main air return vent in the living room wall. His hands were shaking, but he was driven by a desperate need for answers. He unscrewed the metal grill. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out. He shone his flashlight into the dark opening. The ductwork was new and clean, just as Stan, the maintenance man, had said. He reached his arm inside, phone in hand, recording a video as he pushed it deeper. He felt nothing but smooth, cold metal. Disappointed, he was about to put the grill back on when he noticed something. Deeper inside, where the metal duct met the main concrete support wall of the building, the texture of the concrete looked different. It was rougher, darker, as if a patch had been applied after the initial construction. Tapping it with the handle of his screwdriver, he heard a hollow sound. For the next 4 hours, Mark worked in a feverish haze. He chipped away at the concrete patch with a hammer and chisel. Dust filled the air. His arms ached, but he was relentless. Finally, the concrete gave way, revealing a small cavity within the wall. And inside that cavity, nestled in old, crumbling insulation, was a small black metal box. It was heavy, cold to the touch, and had no visible markings except a faded serial number stamped on its side. Old, brittle wires protruded from one end, leading nowhere. It was a listening device, a bug, something from another era, an artifact of the Cold War, inexplicably entombed within the walls of his modern apartment. He carefully pulled it out and set it on the floor. And as he did, he realized something. The HVAC system was still running, but the whisper was gone. The air coming from the vents was just air. A profound wave of relief washed over him, so powerful. His knees felt weak. He had won. He had found the source. He had solved the logical problem. It was just a strange electronic echo, a ghost in the machine. He laughed, a raw, shaky sound. He picked up the old bug, intending to march down to Stan's office on Monday and show him what he'd found. He placed the device on his polished concrete coffee table, a relic of the past in his temple of modernism. He was about to finally try and get some sleep when his cell phone sitting on the counter rang. The cell phone screen lit up and the text "unknown number" appeared. He hesitated for a second, then answered, a triumphant grin on his face, ready to tell whoever it was that they had the wrong number. The line was filled with a familiar crackling static. But through the static, a voice, the same dry, papery whisper from the vents, spoke, clearer than ever before. It said, "You found it. Now put it back." Mark's blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't coming from the vents anymore. It was coming from his phone. It was everywhere. He had found the ghost in the machine, but he had made a terrible mistake. He had assumed the ghost was trapped in the machine. He never considered that the machine was just how it chose to speak. And now that he had taken its first voice away, it had found a new one.
Come home.
Grief is a ghost. It follows you. It whispers to you in moments of silence, and sometimes it convinces you that you're hearing things that can't possibly be real. Chloe knew this. As a 29-year-old social worker, she understood the mechanics of loss. But understanding grief and living inside its suffocating fog are two very different things. She hadn't been back to her childhood home on Willow Creek Road in 5 years. Not since her mother, Eleanor, had passed away from a sudden, aggressive illness. Her father, unable to bear the memories haunting every room, had sold the house quickly to a property investment company that left it sitting empty, a silent monument on a lonely street. But a clerical error with the final deed transfer required Chloe's signature. One last, painful goodbye she had been dreading. She pulled into the driveway on a gray, overcast afternoon. The house was exactly as she remembered it, just less. The vibrant garden her mother had poured her soul into was now a tangle of brown weeds. The paint on the porch swing was peeling, the wood gray and weathered. The silence was the hardest part. It was a physical weight, pressing in on her, amplifying the absence of her mother's laughter, the scent of her baking, the sound of her humming. This house wasn't just empty, it was hollowed out. The new owners had given her the key and asked if she could also clear out any remaining personal effects from the basement, a task her father had never managed to face. Armed with a box of trash bags and a heavy heart, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and potpourri, her mother's signature fragrance still faintly clinging to the air. She spent the first hour walking through the rooms, her hand trailing over familiar furniture, each object a landmine of memory. She started in the living room, boxing up old books and photo albums. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. She tried to fill the silence with the crinkle of packing paper, the scrape of a box on the floor. It was while she was kneeling, wrapping an old porcelain figurine, that she first heard it. A whisper, so faint, it was almost indistinguishable from the sigh of the wind outside. "Chloe." She froze, every muscle tensed. It sounded like her mother. Her rational mind immediately supplied an answer. It was a memory, a trick of a grieving brain trying to find comfort. She shook her head, a tear escaping and tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "It's not real," she whispered to herself. She forced herself to continue working, but her senses were now on high alert. Every creak of the house made her jump. An hour later, she was in her mother's old bedroom, folding away clothes that still smelled faintly of her. The whisper came again, this time clearer, closer. It seemed to be coming from the hallway, near the top of the basement stairs. "Chloe, down here." Her heart leaped into her throat. This was different. It wasn't just a sound, it was a direction, a summons. She stood up and walked slowly out of the bedroom. The hallway was dim, the door to the basement closed. Her mother had always hated that basement. She'd called it damp and dreary, and would only go down there to do laundry, always leaving the door wide open. A part of Chloe, the logical part, the part that had seen too much of the world's harsh realities in her line of work, screamed at her to ignore it, to get out of the house and never look back. But the grieving part, the part that ached with a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical wound, was stronger. The part that would give anything to hear her mother's voice just one more time. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The voice answered, full of a familiar, loving warmth that brought fresh tears to her eyes. "I missed you, my sweet girl." That was all it took. Logic evaporated, replaced by a desperate, consuming hope. Was it possible? Could some part of her mother have stayed behind, waited for her? She walked to the basement door, her hand shaking as she reached for the cold brass knob. She could have run, called her father, done anything other than what she did next. But the voice was a perfect imitation of her mother's love, a siren song for a grieving heart. She felt compelled to follow, to believe. So, she turned the knob and descended the creaking stairs, stepping out of the light and into the cold, damp dark of the basement, searching for a ghost that was never there. The basement was just as she remembered it. The air smelled of damp earth and laundry soap. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, distorted shadows. On one side was the old washer and dryer. On the other, shelves lined with dusty jars of her mother's canned peaches and beans. The whisper guided her, not with words, but with a feeling, a pull. "Over here, my love, behind the stones." Her gaze fell upon the far wall. It was part of the house's original stone foundation. But one section behind an old rickety shelving unit looked different. The mortar between the stones was crumbling, and one large flat stone seemed almost loose. Her mother's voice, full of gentle encouragement, urged her on. "I left something for you. A secret." Her hands were clumsy as she moved the shelving. Unit aside, it was lighter than it looked. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the crumbling mortar around the loose stone. It shifted easily. With a grunt, she pulled it free, revealing a dark, hollow space within the foundation wall. A cold, musty air flowed out from the opening. Inside the cavity was a small tin box, rusted at the hinges. With trembling fingers, she lifted it out. It was heavier than it should have been. She sat on the cold concrete floor and pried the lid, open. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, was a diary. It wasn't her mother's. The leather cover was worn, the handwriting inside elegant and looping, but unfamiliar. The first page was dated 1958. It was her grandmother's journal, a woman she had never known, who had died in this very house long before Chloe was born. She began to read. The early entries were normal. Notes about the garden, complaints about the weather, mentions of her husband. But then the tone shifted. October 12, 1958. I heard Mother's voice today. It's been a year since she passed, but I heard her, clear as a bell, calling to me from the basement. I know it's just grief playing tricks on my mind, but it was so comforting to hear her again. Chloe's blood ran cold. She flipped ahead. October 29th, 1958. The voice is more frequent now. It tells me it misses me. It asks me to come down to the basement, to a loose stone in the wall. It says there's a gift waiting for me. I feel drawn to it, but John says I'm imagining things. He says the house is just old. Chloe's hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold the book. She turned to the last entry. The handwriting was frantic, scratching into the page. November 5th, 1958. It's not her. It's not my mother. The voice changed today. It became cold when I told it I wouldn't come. It said it was hungry. It said it's been in these walls for a long, long time. It promises peace, but it lies. It doesn't want comfort. It wants company. It wears the voices of the dead like a coat, waiting for one of us to let it in. It's in the walls. Oh God, it's in the entry cut off mid-sentence. Chloe stared at the final frantic words. The whisper returned. But this time, the loving maternal warmth was gone. It was a cacophony, a layered chorus of voices, a man's deep grumble, a child's high-pitched cry, an old woman's rasp, all whispering over each other, a discordant mess of sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones around her. Then, the voices merged, coalescing into a single entity, a voice that was ancient, cold, and filled with a bottomless, chilling hunger. It spoke, no longer a whisper, but a clear, resonant statement that echoed in the small, damp room. You were never supposed to find that. Chloe scrambled backward, dropping the diary. The single bulb above her flickered violently. But it doesn't matter, the voice continued, seeming to come from the dark cavity in the wall, from the earth beneath her, from the air itself. A daughter always comes home. With a deafening boom that shook the entire house, the heavy basement door at the top of the stairs slammed shut, plunging Chloe into absolute, suffocating darkness. The single bulb popped, its filament glowing, for a split second before dying completely, and in the pitch black, the whispering started again. But now it was all around her, coming from every wall, and it was no longer calling her name. It was just laughing.
What a beautiful baby.
For new parents, the world shrinks. It becomes the four walls of a nursery, the soft rhythm of a baby's breathing, and the single, unwavering light of a baby monitor. For Ben and Emily, that little electronic eye was their connection to peace of mind. It was a top-of-the-line video monitor, a gift from Emily's parents, promising a secure, encrypted signal. It allowed them, in the precious few moments they weren't in the room with their newborn son Isaac, to know that he was safe. In their new home, a charming two-story in a quiet, leafy suburb, that monitor was a technological godsend. For the Afrana, first few weeks, it brought them nothing but comfort. Then, one night, it brought them terror. It began, as these things often do, at the edge of perception. Ben was on monitor duty, sitting on the couch downstairs, trying to stay awake while Emily got some much-needed sleep. It was just after 3 a.m. The monitor screen showed Isaac sleeping soundly, a grainy black-and-white angel. But the audio feed, usually a soft hum of white noise, had a strange quality to it. A rhythmic crackle, a faint hiss that pulsed in time with the baby's breathing. Ben adjusted the antenna, assuming it was interference. Cordless phones, a neighbor's Wi-Fi, he knew the usual culprits. A few nights later, Emily heard it. She was feeding Isaac in the nursery's rocking chair, the receiver unit on the nightstand beside her. The static wasn't just a hiss anymore. Woven into its fabric was a sound, a dry, papery whisper. It was unintelligible, formless, but it had the cadence of speech. She picked up the receiver, held it to her ear, and listened. The sound vanished, replaced by the familiar, comforting sound of the room's fan. She shook her head, blaming her exhaustion. Sleep deprivation makes you hear things, she told Ben the next morning. He agreed, but didn't mention the hissing. He had heard days earlier. Neither wanted to worry the other. The whispers, however, grew more confident. One night, as they both sat on the couch watching the monitor together, it came through clearly. A single, drawn-out word, like a sigh, shaped into sound. Isaac. They looked at each other, eyes wide. Did you hear that? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper itself. Emily nodded, her face pale. They turned the volume up, listening intently. For a long time, there was only static. Then it came again, closer this time, more defined. "Isaac?" "It's the neighbor's monitor," Ben said, a little too quickly. "We're picking up their feed. It's a common problem with these analog models." But this wasn't an analog model. It was a digital frequency hopping unit guaranteed to be secure. Still, it was the only logical explanation. The next day, Ben went out and bought the most expensive monitor in the store, one used in hospitals, with a fully encrypted signal. "Nothing is getting through this," he declared as he set it up. For 2 nights, the new monitor offered blessed silence. They started to relax, laughing at how paranoid they had become. They were just tired new parents, after all. On the 3rd night, their laughter died. The new monitor crackled to life. There was no interference, no static, just a crystal-clear, horrifyingly intimate whisper that seemed to be speaking directly into the microphone in Isaac's room. "He has my eyes." Ben was off the couch before the whisper had even finished. He sprinted up the stairs and burst into the nursery. The room was still, peaceful. Isaac was sleeping soundly in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Ben leaned over him, his heart pounding. Isaac's eyes were closed, but Ben knew what color they were. A deep sapphire blue, just like his own. He backed out of the room, closing the door softly, his mind reeling. How? How could anyone know that? They hadn't posted photos online. They were private people. That was the turning point. The monitor was no longer a comfort. It was a source of dread. They began taking turns sleeping in the nursery with Isaac, refusing to leave him alone. But the exhaustion was brutal. After a week, they were both walking zombies. One afternoon, while Isaac was napping, Emily decided she had to know more. She sat at her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She didn't know what she was looking for, just something. She searched the town's public records, the history of their address. The house had been built in 1985. The previous owners were an elderly couple who had retired to Florida. Everything seemed normal, but Emily was persistent. She dug deeper, searching old newspaper archives online, using keywords: Willow Street, tragedy, child. It was a small article, buried on page C4 of the local paper, the Grafton Chronicle, dated November 12, 1988. It was a short, tragic story about a local family, one that had been all but forgotten by the town. The headline made Emily's blood run cold. "Infant boy missing," father questioned. What they were hearing on the monitor wasn't just a random ghost. It was the echo of an unsolved crime, and they were sleeping right in the middle of it. The article was brief. An 8-month-old infant, Isaac Miller, had vanished from his crib in the middle of the night from the house at 112 Willow Street, their house. There were no signs of forced entry. The parents, Robert and Susan Miller, claimed they had slept through the entire night. The police, the article noted, were skeptical of the father's story. Robert Miller had claimed to see a strange man lurking in the neighborhood days before the disappearance, but he had no proof. The community whispered about the father's odd behavior, his withdrawn nature. The case eventually went cold. Isaac Miller was never found. A few years later, Robert Miller, a man broken by grief and suspicion, died of a massive heart attack. Susan Miller sold the house and moved away. Ben and Emily read the article together, the words blurring through their tears. The same house, the same room, the same name. "We have to leave, Ben," Emily whispered. "We have to get out of this house." They decided to pack that very night, to stay with Emily's parents until they could find a new place. They worked in a frantic, quiet rush, throwing clothes and baby supplies into boxes. They had packed the baby monitor away first, stuffing it into a box in the hallway, wanting its presence gone. As Ben was hauling the last of the boxes downstairs, the house fell completely silent. The power had gone out. He fumbled for his phone, its flashlight cutting a weak beam through the darkness. Then from the hallway came the sound. The monitor, unplugged and buried in a box, had turned on by itself. The static was deafening, a roar that filled the house. And through the roar, the whisper came, no longer soft, but filled with a raw, guttural anguish. "Where did you take him? Where is my son?" It was a cry of pure agony. The voice of Robert Miller, the father, trapped in an eternal loop of his worst moment. He wasn't whispering to their Isaac, he was screaming for his own. Ben and Emily huddled together at the bottom of the stairs, clutching their sleeping son, paralyzed by the spectral grief echoing around them. And then, the impossible happened. A second voice cut through the static, this one cold, cruel, and unfamiliar. "He is not your son, Robert. You know what you did." Ben and Emily stared at each other in the dim light of the phone. A second ghost? Before they could process it, a third voice joined in, a woman's voice choked with sobs. "Robert, why? Why did you do it?" They weren't just hearing the father's ghost. They were hearing the entire tragic argument of the Miller family, replaying itself through the airwaves. The monitor had become a receiver for a conversation from hell. The father's desperate denials, the mother's heartbroken accusations, the cold voice of an unknown party. The argument on the monitor escalated into a terrifying, overlapping chorus of screams and sobs. But the sound was no longer just coming from the box in the hallway. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very air around them. The house itself was screaming. Ben didn't wait for more. He grabbed Emily's arm, pulled her and the baby towards the front door, and they ran. They burst out into the cold night, not looking back, the sound of the spectral argument chasing them down the driveway. They jumped into their car and sped away, leaving the house on Willow Street to its eternal unresolved tragedy. They never went back. The next day, they hired movers to retrieve their things, instructing them to leave the box with the baby monitor behind. Some things they had learned are better left buried in the static.
So cold.
Our final story is about a man who believed he understood the wilderness. Alex wasn't just a camper, he was a student of isolation. A former physics researcher, he had left the world of academia for a life of pure logic and self-reliance, building a remote cabin deep in the mountains of Montana. This cabin wasn't just a home, it was his fortress, a testament to his belief that any challenge, be it nature's fury or the mind's own deceptions, could be overcome with preparation and rational thought. He knew the sounds of the forest better than most people know the streets of their own city. He knew the rustle of a deer, the cry of a hawk, and the sound of the wind howling through the pines. He was prepared for the wind to play tricks, to sound like voices, a phenomenon he knew as auditory pareidolia. He was prepared for tricks of the mind. He wasn't prepared for the real thing. The blizzard arrived on the third day of his winter solitude. It came not as a gentle snowfall, but as an invading force, a wall of white that swallowed the landscape whole. The wind screamed, a physical presence that slammed against the sturdy log walls of his cabin. Alex was unfazed. He stoked the wood stove, checked the seals on his windows, and settled into his armchair with a book on quantum mechanics. This was precisely the kind of challenge he relished. It was then that he first heard it. A faint sound, woven into the gale's roar, that seemed to curve around the edge of the cabin. "Alex." He paused his reading, a slight academic smile touching his lips. He even made a note in the margin of his book. Auditory pareidolia pronounced in winds exceeding 50 mmol/h. The mind craves patterns, even where none exist. He felt a sense of smug satisfaction. He was observing a textbook psychological phenomenon firsthand, but the whisper didn't stop. It became a recurring motif in the storm's symphony, sometimes seeming to come from the north, sometimes the west. It circled the cabin. A prickle of primal unease began to form at the base of his neck, but he pushed it down with logic. "It's just the wind finding new cracks in the old wood," he told himself, "creating new frequencies, new sounds for my brain to misinterpret." His fortress of logic held firm for hours. Then, just after midnight, the world outside exploded in a flash of blue-white light as a nearby transformer was struck by lightning. The cabin's generator, his humming bastion against the storm, sputtered and died. He was plunged into a darkness and silence so absolute, it felt like the universe had been turned off. The only sound left was the raw, untamed howl of the wind, and in that sudden, profound quiet, the whisper came again. But it wasn't outside anymore. It wasn't in the wind. It was on the other side of the room, near the cold, dark fireplace. It was a dry, close, intimate sound. Lex. His blood ran cold. The rational explanations evaporated. His fortress had been breached, but not by the storm. Something had been let in by the silence. He didn't move for an hour. He sat in his armchair, every muscle locked, every sense screaming. He clutched the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his only weapon against an enemy he couldn't see. The whisper began to move. He heard a floorboard creak in the small loft above him, a soft thump, as if something had dropped onto the floor. He heard a drawer in the kitchen slide open with a soft scrape, then shut. These weren't tricks of the mind. This was an intruder, an impossible intruder who had entered a cabin sealed against a blizzard without making a sound until the power was gone. He knew then that leaving the safety of his chair, investigating the sounds, would be a fatal mistake, so he waited. He sat through a night of unimaginable terror, listening to the subtle sounds of another presence sharing his space in the pitch black, the whisper occasionally returning, closer each time, a serpent in the dark. As the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, the sound stopped. The house fell silent once more. The storm had broken, leaving behind a world buried in white. Alex, exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, felt a sliver of hope. He waited until the sun was fully up, its light filling the cabin, before he dared to move. He stood on shaky legs, the poker still gripped in his white-knuckled hand. He cautiously moved the barricade he'd made with the armchair and surveyed the room. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The kitchen drawers were closed. The loft was empty. Nothing was out of place. Relief washed over him, so potent it almost brought him to his knees. It must have been his mind. The isolation, the storm, the darkness. It had all conspired to create a powerful, vivid hallucination. He felt foolish, but overwhelmingly grateful to be alive, to have survived a night of his own paranoia. He walked to the large picture window to look out at the snow-covered landscape, to see the damage from the storm. He let out a long, shaky breath, the warmth of it fogging a large patch of the cold glass. He was safe. The ordeal was over, and as the fog on the window cleared, he saw it. The message wasn't traced on the frost on the inside. The letters were etched into the thick layer of frost on the outside of the glass, written backward, so they were perfectly legible to him from within. The handwriting was elegant, almost calligraphic. The message was not what he expected. It didn't say, "I'm still here" or "I see you." It asked a simple, terrifying question. "Where is Alex?" Alex froze, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The whisper. It hadn't been calling to him. It had been looking for him. And in that final, horrifying moment of revelation, staring at his own distorted reflection in the glass, a truth he had long buried clawed its way to the surface. He, the man in the cabin, the survivalist, the rational academic, was not Alex. He was the intruder. He was the thing that had taken Alex's place, living in his cabin, thinking his thoughts. The whispers hadn't been a haunting. They had been the house itself, the very spirit of the place, trying to find its true owner. He stumbled back from the window, the poker clattering to the floor. He looked at his hands, his clothes, his reflection. They were all a lie. He was the monster in the story, and the real Alex was gone. A haunted house passed down through generations, an electronic ghost, a family tragedy, a case of mistaken identity, or something far worse. 5 stories of a sound that should never be heard. The next time you're alone and you hear a whisper, you have to ask yourself, is it just the wind? Is it a memory? Or has something finally learned your name and realized you're not who it's looking for? If you survived these stories, subscribe to Whispered Fear and leave a like. Your engagement helps us find more whispers in the dark. Now, if you're brave enough to question your own reflection, click the video on your screen to hear 3 true stories of people who saw their own doppelganger, and find out what happens when you meet yourself in the dark. See you there, if you dare.